Hello, genealogy fans and friends and most likely family. I'm Julie Huffman, genealogy librarian at the Los Angeles Public Library, and welcome to our monthly genealogy program, Genealogy Garage. Genealogy Garage happens the third Saturday of every month, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. roughly, Pacific Standard Time. And it's co-sponsored by the Southern California Genealogical Society and the Genealogical Society of Hispanic America, Southern California chapter. Next month, I'm really excited to have two presenters who will be talking about Armenian genealogy. So that will be really interesting. And if you have any Armenian friends out there, let them know. And if you would like to be added to my email list to hear about upcoming presentations, you can see my email address up there on the screen right next to my name. So just shoot me an email and I'll add you. So I hope you all have been able to break down some brick walls during this time of closure. And I just wanted to let you know that the Word is In Ancestry.com Library Edition will still be available for us to access from home if you have a library card through June. So you still have some time to practice with it, experiment with it for free, as long as you have one of our library cards. And also, I just want to let you know, our e-media provider, one of our main e-media providers, Overdrive, has really been adding a lot of genealogy titles to its e-media, and I've been ordering like crazy. So go to our catalog and see what we have. I just want to show you an example of how you'd find an e-media item on our catalog. Okay, here is our website at lapl.org, and you would scroll down to ebooks and audiobooks, and from there click on Overdrive. And I'll just give you a short example that might wet your whistle a little bit. You go to search and just type in keywords like, for instance, Irish or Ireland genealogy, and just see what comes up. And you'll see all kinds of great books on genealogy related to Irish families. You can even see there are some family histories here. So if your last name is Preston, here's a whole family history waiting for you to check out. So give that a shot when you have a moment. Okay, now let's get started with our event. A couple housekeeping things. There is a handout that corresponds to this presentation located in the description on the Facebook and the YouTube page. And you can click on that, and it's a PDF, and you can download it for your reference. Also, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and when we have a break in the presentation or at the end, I can ask George your question. And this is being recorded, but it's only going to be live to be viewed after the fact for a couple weeks. So if you have friends that missed it, let them know that they should try to watch it soon. So, George Mouchet has been active in the genealogy community for years. He is the past president of the Antelope Valley Genealogical Society, and he's done several presentations for us at the Los Angeles Public Library. So we're super grateful to people like George who volunteer their time to tell our community the ins and outs of specific genealogy subjects. And so I'm very happy today to welcome George. And let's just bring up his presentation real quick. Okay, George,
All right.
take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So this talk is going to be in two sections. The first part will be all about how to find where your ancestor came from, and the second part will be about how to locate Irish records. So this first part is useful not only just for Irish ancestry, but any ancestry you have outside of the U.S.
George, I think you're muted. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you start actually over at the very beginning?
Sorry about that. I
No problem.
thought I collected. I thought I clicked unmute. Okay, I will back up. Okay. Okay. So, do I sound good now?
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. So, this talk is going to be in two sections. The first part will be all about how to find where your ancestor came from, and that's good for anybody, any ancestor you're looking for outside of the country, outside of the U.S. The second part will be specifically about how to locate Irish records. So, the first step, the first thing to do is make sure you've proved your way back to the ancestor. You may have family stories or other information that there's an ancestor you want to research from Ireland, for example, and be aware that there's a lot of common names, and you want to make sure you have the right person. Also, research all the children in a family, not just your direct ancestors, and ask your other family members for what they know. I mean, it is, you have to take what they say with a grain of salt. Family stories are not always true, but they can give you definite hints, things to check out. When I told my mother I wanted to research our family history about 20 years ago, she put me in touch with two of her cousins who had already collected information, including photos, family Bibles, and family sheets. And that was definitely helpful for me. In Ireland in particular, there are a lot of common names. Here's an example that I found online from this Irish genealogy toolkit. And in this person's research, in her family, she found, just taking in 1864, she had 232 Marys, 120 Margarets, 81 Catherines, 143 Johns, 142 Patricks, 90 James, a lot of very common names. And same thing with surnames. There's a lot of common surnames in Irish genealogy, and that can sometimes be confusing. You'll have a hard time pinning down your ancestors if you don't have other information about them. And just as an aside, the other thing you might have noticed here is that by the time we get to the 1800s, most Irish parents are giving their children English names. These days in Ireland and America too, for that matter, the old Irish names have become popular again. But for example, I don't know if you probably know some Aidens and Brandons and Ryans and Morgans, Caitlins and Kaylas. Those are all modern names that are derived from old Ireland. But on this list, other than Patrick and Bridget, these are all really primarily English names. So one of the key pieces of information you'll want to find out is what is the town and what are the town and county your ancestors come from. Of course, if you can find the town, you'll find the county. That's particularly important with this duplicate name problem, but also because of the way the records are organized by town and parish. So here's some records that may give you what the town was in Ireland. Obituaries are great because they're biographies, little mini biographies about the person who died. In a newspaper called the Boston Pilot, there was this Lost Friends column that's available online. I'll show that in a bit. And it's got some great information. Naturalization records may show the town they came from, military pensions, county histories. Now, the British and Irish census you may be able to identify a person because it does show all the families there, although the Irish census records are rather limited. Passenger lists, and of course compiled genealogy. So these would be things you find on other people's work, you find on Ancestry and Family Search, and also compiled genealogies and books. Just be aware that there could be errors. If they haven't given you their sources, you'll want to double check all that to make sure that's really correct. Here's an example of a newspaper obituary. And you can see here the deceased clergyman was born in Milton, Malby, Clare County, Ireland, about 45 years ago. So you take that with the date of the newspaper, and you know what town he came from. So this is what I was mentioning, the Lost Friends column in the Boston Pilot. This was a Irish newspaper that people subscribed to all over the U.S. By mail. And when people were looking for their friends, they'd put in these ads. So here's an example. William Harvey, who left Innistrogue County, Kilkenny, Ireland, about 40 years ago with his wife and family for Canada. It shows where he is employed and anything else they knew about him. Jeremiah Holland, native of Macroom, County Cork, Ireland. So a lot of great information you can find in this column, and it is available online. Naturalization records. Oh, by the way, to find the Boston Pilot online, just Google it, and it'll take you right to it. Also, Find My Past does have the Boston Pilot indexed. You can search there rather easily. So naturalization records are a little more difficult to find sometimes. Many of them are on Family Search. You may find them also on Ancestry, but there's this dividing line in the U.S. between pre-1906 and post-1906. Before 1906, any court could naturalize a person. That would be a municipal court, a state court, a federal court, a family court, any type of criminal court, any type of court could do this. And the forms and the information they collected varied, and your access to them will vary. In other words, you may not even know what court they were naturalized in. And if those records are not online, you may not know how to ask for them or what court to contact. Post 1906, it's easier because those records are now held by the Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the federal government standardized the forms and the whole process. So that made a big improvement for accessibility to these naturalization records. So pre-1906, there's a form called the Declaration of Intent, and or naturalization petition, depending on what they called the form. And this form is the most likely place where you will find where the person was born. So, for example, here, this petitioner was born on or about the 9th day of March, 1872, it looks like, County Down. So at least we get the county here. Often you'll also see the town, and that will give you the information you need to tie down where this person came from. After 1906, the Declaration of Intent or Declaration of Intention form will pretty much always include the date of birth and the town and county of birth, and also where they last lived before immigrating, which may not have been where they were born. So here's an example: Christopher James Pattison, County Down, Ireland. And it shows when he was born, where he lives now, where he immigrated from. And so these are all, and it's last foreign residence. Be aware that where they immigrated from, that's really where they got on the ship. They didn't necessarily live in Liverpool at any particular time. Probably the county downwards, this last foreign residence, that was where they last lived. Another great one is World War II draft registration. These are available both on Family Search and on Ancestry.com. And this nearly always gives the town of birth. I say nearly because I found some that haven't. So here's one, Harvey Murphy, and he was born in Kiscaran, Ireland. So that's great. That was exactly what we needed. This might be the if there was a World War I draft record for your ancestor, this might be the first place to look, because these records are easy to find. On the other hand, one of the hardest records to, well, the one's more expensive and takes more effort, let me put it that way, to access is the Civil War pension files. So if your ancestor, if your male ancestor lived during a time where he may have been in the Civil War, either drafted or enlisted, he may have a Civil War pension file. Now, in order to qualify for a pension, excuse me, the veteran had to be pretty much destitute, or his widow had to be destitute. So just because they were in the Civil War doesn't mean that they would have a pension record. But in this example, this is an ancestor of mine, and his Civil War pension file does show in an affidavit from a friend of theirs who knew them in Ireland. She writes, they were married by the Reverend John Armstrong of the Second Presbyterian Church in Castledurg, County Tyrone, Ireland, on April 2, 1841. So this is great, because this also gives me another record I can look for, and it gives me the town that he came from, and also that his wife came from. So county histories are another great source of information. Here's an example of a biography of Michael Curtis, and it shows that he was born in County Cavan, Ireland, in 1828. So county histories are kind of an interesting deal. There were people who made their living off of going from town to town, collecting this information and publishing in a book, and then selling it to the townspeople. So this is another situation where pretty much the only people who are going to be listed in the county history are the people who could afford to buy the book. So they didn't necessarily have to be rich, but the poorest people would have been left out of most county histories, because the publishers would have figured this would have not have been a good sale. So I think I should go into a little bit about using Google Books. So these kind of histories are available in libraries, including the LA Public Library. But at this stage of things, Google Books is a great place to look for these. On Family Search, in the Family Search catalog, you'll also see a link to finding books there by title, and that they also index other libraries, such as the Allen County Public Library, as well as their own. And some of those books are available for download and some aren't. But on Google Books, any book that's out of copyright will be available for download for free. So here I searched Michael Curtis, LaSalle County, Illinois, and I get a bunch of results that are not my Michael Curtis. But if I go over to more, and then I choose books, you can see that the second item there is the past and present of LaSalle County. the one that I had found. Plus, there are a few other county histories of the same county, and I highly encourage you to use Google Books. It's not only the search covers beyond Google Books; it also goes to the Internet Archive, the Hathaway Trust, and some other websites that have scanned in books that are out of copyright. So it's really a great resource. So let's talk a little bit about the British and Irish census. Although these are not American records, they're overseas records. If you find your ancestor in them, this will give you a definite clue. So these, in my genealogy discovery, I learned that my French ancestors are half Irish, and this is that family. And Thomas Pattison, the head of household, was born in Drumbridge, County Antrim, which is Ireland. Isabella Johnson Pattison was born in Philadelphia in the U.S. So yes, my Irish ancestors came from the U.S. and ended up in France. And then Thomas Stannis Pattison was born in Lisburn, Antrim. So these are all great clues, and now I know, knowing where they were, I know how to find and where to look for those records. Passenger lists are a great resource. There are two kinds of passenger lists. Immigration, that's coming into a country. So these are passenger lists that were handed in by the ships at U.S. ports. But common from people mostly after 1890 leaving Ireland, there were emigration lists, that's EM, and these people had to fill out forms showing that they were leaving the country. Those are on Find My Past. Ancestry has lots of passenger lists. Find My Past has these emigration lists, and there's also the Irish Emigration Database. If you Google that, you'll see lots of great information about these people, including often where they came from, and it's not a complete overlap with Find My Past. They have different people listed. So here's an example. Says that this Patterson, came from Ireland, Belfast, and that's exactly what we wanted to find out. Ancestry has this interesting, this is a scanned in book, Irish Immigrants in North America, and when you search for a name on Ancestry, this is one of the things that we'll look through, and these often will tell you where a person was born. I suspect that a lot of these were, these lists seem to be people, indentured servants who left their indentured servitude before they completed it. But just based on this, but not all of them. So this last one, Patrick Kesey, you can see he's shipwrecked on Hog Island, resident Belhaven, Virginia, then Baltimore. Oh, he's jailed in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Okay. So some other clues. If some of your immigrants' children were also born in Ireland, you can research the children and find out the same information. So where if there's a good chance that where the children came from is also where the parents came from. And then also the parents, brothers, and sisters, you can research them. And you can always check for friends and neighbors, comparing whatever Irish censuses you can find with the U.S. Census. And there's also some other Irish records that I'll go into towards the end of this that can clue you into who their neighbors were. Often, neighbors and family members migrated together, and if you see the same people in Ireland and in the U.S., that can give you some clues to the migration. So if you see some Irish names in the U.S. Census, you may try and trace those people back to Ireland and see if you find your ancestors there as well. And then another thing is tombstones. A lot of 19th century tombstones for Irish people, it was kind of a fad to make sure and include where the person came from. So this one says Templeboy, County Sligo, Ireland. So that's another clue. And of course, a lot of American tombstones are in Find a Grave and also Billion Graves. So those are some great resources. Okay, so we're about at the halfway point, and I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions. And then Julie is going to post the questions where I can see them.
Yeah, George, here's one that just came through from Jacqueline.
Typically, passenger lists were taken by somebody on the ship. I have not found accuracy problems with them so much as incomplete information. They don't always fill out the form completely, and the earlier passenger lists have a lot less information. And different ships filled out different information too, so you don't always get the town of origin. But I haven't encountered an accuracy problem with passenger lists.
Do you know about that other part, if it was taken down by a civil servant or another official on the ship?
Usually it's an official on the ship. And in fact, the official if you're comparing passenger lists to records that were recorded by a civil servant, it's more likely that a person, not guaranteed, but it's more likely a person on the ship would be more familiar with, for instance, if it was not an English-speaking person on the ship might be more familiar with their language than an immigration official, for example.
And we don't have any more questions at this point, George, if you want to continue, and I'll keep track of them.
Dump my cat here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a sort of a brief, sad history of Ireland. I'll try and keep it short. The Irish War of Independence started in 1919. That precipitated a series of events that did affect genealogy significantly. However, it was really a result of conditions that existed for nearly 300 years since the Irish Confederate Wars. Those earlier wars started as a battle against English and Scottish colonialism in Ireland. After King Charles I was executed by English anti-royalists in 1649, Irish Catholics were massacred, dispossessed of their land, forced into reliance on English landlords. If you want to learn more about that, you can Google Oliver Cromwell. But basically, getting back to 1919, the Irish War of Independence did end after a couple of years with a treaty between Ireland and England. The problem with that treaty was that there were a lot of Irish people who were not happy with it. It resulted in the partition of Ireland into North and South, and there was some sense to that because the North was mostly Protestant, English leaning, and the South was more Irish Catholic. But people were not happy about Ireland being split. So a civil war followed the treaty that pitted rebels against the Irish army. Rebels were storing munitions in the basement of the Public Records Office building when the Irish shelled it. Caught fire, and there were a series of explosions that burned nearly all the records there. So the first time I ever saw a talk on Irish genealogy, the presenter started with this photo and mostly talked about the frustrations of genealogy research in Ireland. But I'm here to tell you that yes, some records were lost, but since the time of that presentation, I saw a lot more records have come online, and things are not really as difficult as you might have heard for Irish genealogy. So first, let's talk about what was lost. So all the censuses prior to 1901 were lost with an asterisk, and I'll talk a little bit about how you might find some of these census records. Most of the Anglican Church records, although what you will find is that a lot of parishes kept copies of those records, or they never sent them to Dublin to begin with, even though they were supposed to. So there are Anglican Church records remaining, and most pre-1858 wills were burned, and other pre-1900 court records. So what survived? The 1901 and 1911 census survived. All the civil registration records, birth, marriage, and death. And that's a big deal. Their civil registration goes back to about 1864. And if you've done research of your ancestors in the Western United States, you've probably noticed that in a lot of places, you won't have any vital records before 1910. Ireland does have those records, and going back much further than you would find in the Western U.S. About half of the Anglican Church records survived, and there were other things like muster rolls for Army, poll taxes, and other church records that survived. Also, Griffith's valuation and the Tithe Applotment rolls survived the fire, and those can act as sort of a census substitute. So let's go to civil registration, which I said is, as I said, is birth, marriage, and death records. There are indexes on Family Search, Ancestry, and Find My Past. And you'll notice Find My Past coming up a lot in this talk because they have really a lot on English and Irish genealogy. So if you decide you want to subscribe to them, it's not too expensive. You can just subscribe for a month or two if you want. And also, I believe, I'm not sure if that's currently the case, but in the past they've been available at Family Search or Family History Centers for free. Oops, sorry, I'll go back. So 1864, civil registration begins. Protestant marriages were actually recorded from 1845. And this is an example. These events, births, marriages, and deaths, were recorded in these big ledgers, and these are all available online at irishgenealogy.ie. We'll show an example of that. So, and after 1922, we have this division between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So after 1922, you're going to the General Register Office of Northern Ireland, which does not have as much online, but you can order records from them now, which you didn't used to be able to. irishgenealogy.ie has all of the pre-1922 records for all of Ireland. Northern Ireland, the General Records Office of Northern Ireland does have copies of those same civil registration records, but not online. So here's an example of how to find these civil registration records. So you'll see there's some buttons to the top. Church records and civil records are the ones we're going to talk about. Research just has some help information if you want more background on what they have and what they're and how to use the site. So if we click on civil records, then we get a place where we can put in the name. So if we put in Martha Pattison, and we're looking for a death record from 1911, for example. Now, of course, you don't have to fill all this in. And I do want to comment that this site is not good with spelling variations. In other words, on Ancestry and Find My Past and Family Search, you can put in one spelling and it'll find all the spelling variations of a name. This one does not do that. So you may have to, especially for first name, you may have to search for a first initial or middle initial, try all the combinations. So we put this in here, and we click on search, and then we have to fill out an application to get the record. Application is just your name and checking a box. So pretty simple. And then we get this I'm not a robot thing, which we check. And then, so here it shows death of Martha Pattison in 1911. Not a lot of information here, but you can click on that brown death of Martha Pattison thing here, and then it will give you more information. And there's even a spot here. Right below the age of her death, it says image. And if you click on that, you'll get the image. And we'll scroll down through this image, and here is Martha Pattison's death record. And it shows her occupation, professor of music, what she died of. Interestingly enough, these death records do not show who the parents were. The birth records show that. The death records, just what they died of and where they were living at the time. So before 1864, you're going to go to church records. This irishgenealogy.ie website does have church records for the Anglican Church, and we'll show an example of some of those. That's the Church of Ireland. They're not complete, but they do go back to the 1600s, and there's overlap with civil registration. So if you don't find a person's civil registration, even after 1864, you can look in the church records. Now, besides the Anglican Church records I mentioned, the vast majority of Irish were Catholic. So you may want to look at Catholic parish registers. The Protestant denominations that were more common were Church of Ireland and Presbyterian being the Scottish influence. There were also some Quakers in Ireland, and there were Jewish people in Ireland. And all these have different sources of records. So Catholic parish registers are online at registers.nli, that's National Library of Ireland.ie. And they're indexed also at ancestry.com and Find My Past. So if you don't find the register you want at the National Library site, try searching on Ancestry or Find My Past. So, okay, well, I kind of talked about that. So let's do a search of church records on irishgenealogy.ie. So these are Anglican church records. And we'll search for Abraham Stoker. So here we see baptism of Abraham Stoker of Clontarf. And you may also know him as Bram Stoker, the writer Dracula. Here is his record, and if you scroll down, there's a place here where you can view the church register containing this record. We'll do that, and I'll sort of focus in, and it gives Abraham Stoker, and this is when he was baptized. This is a register of baptisms. Often, but not always, they will give the date of birth. Interestingly enough, in this record, that's the date of baptism, December 30th, 1847, born. It's like the minister was going to fill in the date of birth, but didn't. So that was interesting. And then There's another record, and of course it shows his parents and stuff. So back to search results, and there was also his first marriage is listed there. And here's what a marriage looks like in these Anglican Church records. Abraham Stoker and Florence Ann Lemon Balcom. And it gives, in these records, it only gives the father's name, not the mother's name, but still it gives you a lot of good information. Here's another example of doing the same search for Oscar Wilde, the playwright. This does have his baptism, but it has his date of birth here too. So you will often find the date of birth on these baptism records. So for church records, I had mentioned Quaker. My ancestors on one side, my Irish ancestors were Quaker, and they were Catholic on the other side. So Find My Past does have Quaker records online, as does Family Search, and the Protestant records you'll find in both those places. So Irish parishes. There's two kinds of parishes in Ireland. The Catholic parishes are how the Catholic records are organized, and then there were civil parishes. These were based on the ancient medieval church parishes, and the Church of Ireland adopted them, and then later those became, for the civil registration, those became the parishes that and the way those records were organized. If you want to see Irish parish maps, there's a great book, the New Genealogical Atlas of Ireland, shows towns and Catholic and civil parishes. It's when libraries start reopening, it is available in the LA City Central Library Genealogy Department. It's at the Southern California Genealogical Library and also the Los Angeles Family Search Library on Santa Monica Boulevard. Online is the Down Survey of Ireland, and that does have parish maps also. So I'd mentioned, sorry, I skipped there. I'd mentioned the Quaker records. This is in Belfast and Lisburn, and the little blue arrows there are my ancestors. This came from Find My Past, but there is also a copy of it on Family Search. And the way the Quakers took records is they had meetings, and at the meetings they took notes of who was born and who got married and who died, and then they saved these notes, but they also compiled them into these ledgers showing vital records. And this is the ledger of births for this meeting, and the Belfast meeting of Quakers that included the nearby town of Lisburn. And here's a enlargement of that. Thomas Stannis Pattison, born 1850, and in Lisburn to Thomas and Isabella. So the 1901 and 1911 Irish censuses are online at the National Archives.ie website. They're indexed on Family Search and Find My Past, and there are some earlier census fragments that survived the fire at Find My Past. But interestingly enough, so pensions were, some pensions burned, some were thrown out, and some were recycled to reuse the paper during a paper shortage in World War I. So it wasn't only the fire in the Four Courts building that destroyed these census records. But in 1909, Ireland implemented a pension, sort of like our Social Security that we have in the U.S. And in order to prove that, in order to prove your birth, you may have to request an extract of census records in lieu of birth certificates, since birth certificates started in 1864. And here, here, what happened was you request this census extract, and the census extracts are transcribed at nationalarchives.ie, but also their images are on Find My Past. So here's an example from Find My Past. Results for Ireland Census Search Forms 1841 and 1851. Now, not everybody is going to be on this, but if your ancestor did file for a 1909 pension, you can get their 1841 or 1851 census. It will be the census that indicates when they were born. And this is what the extract record looks like. John Murphy gives the address. This is the applicant, his current name and address, but it also shows where he was born, residence in 1851. This one is not well filled out, but some of them will give you the complete information, including age and relationship to head of household and the whole thing. But it does have the mother and father here. Newspapers. Find My Past is a great source of Irish newspapers. Unfortunately, not in their library edition. For whatever reason, they don't include newspapers with that. So to get the newspapers, you'll have to shell out the money. But there are other sources of Irish newspapers also. So here's an example. The Quakers who had Thomas Stannis Pattison as was their son, and we saw the Quaker records. This is their marriage, and I was unable to find their marriage in the Irish church records, possibly because they had burned, and the Quaker records. When I contacted the Quaker archives, they couldn't find the marriage records. So Find My Past had a newspaper records. And what it says in this tiny print, on the 13th in St. Anne's Church, Belfast, by the Reverend Mr. Outland, Mr. Thomas Pattison to Isabella Johnson, only daughter of the late Richard Green, Esquire of Philadelphia. So that's interesting because this also gives her father, which that was the first time I had found any mention of her father. And I'll briefly talk about that Latin abbreviation INST, because this comes up in newspapers not only in 19th century newspapers in Ireland, but also in the US. INST means this month, and ULT means last month. And in property transactions listed in newspapers, you'll see et ux means, now I know I'm not pronouncing this right, so I apologize for any Latin scholars out there. Et ux means and wife, and relict means widow. So you can also look at general newspaper websites. Access Newspaper Archives has some Dublin newspapers, and it's free for LA Public Library card holders from the LA Public Library website. Newspapers.com has a larger collection of Irish newspapers, but it is focused in Dublin and Belfast. There's also some smaller sites, irishgenealogy.ie, and then the Gazette, which is the official newspaper record for Great Britain, which included Ireland, and it has, you may find information there about incorporations and things like that. So Griffith's valuation, 1847 to 1864. This is a good census substitute. It shows property owners and tenants and property values. It's free to search at accommodations.ie. Unfortunately, it's head of household only. So you may or may not be able to tell if there's more than one person with the same name in a town, but you may not be able to pin down who it is. But it does have a list of people, how much land they owned and rented, and what the value was, and all sorts of other cool information like that. And their acres were slightly different than an American acre. Roods and perches were subdivisions of acres, and you can look that up. You can Google that if you find one of these records and you want to kind of translate it. The valuation was in pounds, shillings, and pence. It's pretty much impossible now to convert the money amount to modern money with between the currency translation and inflation and everything. It's a little hard to make sense out of what those amounts of money actually meant. But a fancy house might be worth £4 or more, but a 2 or 3 pound cottage, maybe £2, and a mud hut might cost £1. So they give you some kind of idea. The other source is the Tithe Applotment books. So the Church of Ireland, this English church, required all rural property owners over 1 acre to tithe to the Church of Ireland. Now, as you can imagine, this is pretty unpopular. However, because most of the vast majority of landowners during this time were English, and the Church of Ireland was an English church, it makes more sense than you might think. So the books showed the amount of tithing from each head of household. And so we can do a search here, and here it displays one result, and then you can click on the name, and it shows what this is not my Thomas Patterson, by the way, but it's a different one, but it does show how much tithing he paid. Cemetery research in Ireland is kind of interesting because find a grave and billion graves are not all that popular there as like they are here. You may find individual cemetery websites, and you may end up looking at books of Irish headstone inscriptions, and these books are available both on Google Books and most genealogy libraries. The interesting thing about books is that they'll record headstones that are not that may no longer be visible even. So they may be a good resource that that is not even available today, or could never be available online from people taking pictures in cemeteries. So there's a couple of websites that focus on Ireland: irishgraveyards.ie, historicgraves.com, and you can Google to look for sites that only cover a few cemeteries. There's this one mentioned here that covers only Dublin cemeteries, but there's other websites that will index 2 or 3 cemeteries. So books can be great information. Google Books will have, which I showed you before, will have you can actually download these books. Also, Family Search Catalog is a good source. So here's an example of, this is my Patterson line, and it starts out, this headstone transcription is very long, and it talks about William Patterson of Drumbridge, late of Lisburn, so where he was born, where he died, the date he died, the date he was born, the date he died, his wife, when she died and how old she was, and also their son was buried there too, and he died at Paris on April 5th, 1883. So this is part of that, my French background that's half Irish. So a lot of great information in these headstone inscriptions sometimes. um, and coming towards the kind of wrapping up, I highly recommend that you use Family Search Wiki to help you find these resources. There are many more besides what I've mentioned here, and you can just go to Family Search Wiki and type in Ireland online genealogy records, and or you can even find it in Google and get to Family Search Wiki, and you'll be amazed at how much there really is. So here is the page, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but you can see it's got civil records and vital records, immigration, pastorate lists. This lists sources or records not only on Family Search, but any other website where you might find them. And we'll scroll down, land records, Jewish records, Northern Ireland post-1922, military records, Catholics, Quakers, nonconformists, newspapers, obituaries, occupations, biographies, it just goes on and on and on. I didn't even do the screen captures all the way to the bottom of this. But the point is that plenty of records are available. Oftentimes, other than census, you'll probably find more records than you would find in, for example, the Western U.S. If possible, find the town your ancestor immigrated from and have the luck of the Irish. And while you're thinking about this, I suggest that you should think about what your next step is. What do you want to do with your Irish research? Who do you want to research? And sort of think about it, plan out what the next step is. And here's my email address. If you have any questions, you can ask them now, but you can also email me if you like.
Wow, thanks, George. That was awesome. So many resources. And by the way, if you feel overwhelmed by all the resources presented in his presentation, make sure to download that handout. And if you have trouble doing that, email me and I'll send it to you. Or you can rewatch this presentation for a couple weeks just by following the same links you did to watch it today. So you can watch it, pause it, write down what you're thinking. So don't be overwhelmed by just the sheer number of resources George presented. There's a way to do that. So George, we do have a couple questions. This one I think is dynamite because everyone has experienced this at some point. Oops, that one's number 2. One second. This is asked before.
Well, for ancestors with common names, really, you just have to research the whole family. If you find the same people, the like Thomas Rowe, if you find his wife in Ireland or his parents, his siblings, and then you find the same people in America, because often the ancestors, the families migrated together, or one family would come and then the next one would follow. You have to remember that especially during the potato famine and then in later years, there was desperate poverty in Ireland. It's much like Italy in that regard, and people would migrate en masse. I've heard a statistic. There are far more people of Irish descent living outside of Ireland than live inside of Ireland, and a lot of it was this mass exodus that started with the potato famine and went through probably the 1920s or so.
And
so that's my suggestion. Research the whole family.
Yeah, good policy. Here was a comment that someone put up when you were talking about online newspapers, and I hadn't heard of the British Newspaper Archive, so I will immediately seek that out.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one either. As far as I know, In Ireland, the graves are left intact. Um, they're not always maintained. So if a church, if it's a church graveyard and the church is no longer used, it'll be let go. The church will fall over, the headstones will fall over or get vandalized or whatever. Um, but there's no policy like that where graveyards are um, are are not left intact or anything. In London, I believe there have been. I read once that some of the cemeteries in London were picked up and moved, and others, because the land was so valuable, they were just taken down. Uh, so you may find that in London, where the cemetery is no longer there, just because the land became so valuable that they wanted to build on it. But there also are some old cemeteries in London. Um, but in Ireland, pretty much the cemeteries are still there. But what state of repair they're in, it varies by cemetery.
And here's a question from someone just wondering your personal preference.
Oh, I like what device I use. First off, I think it's important to have my family tree on my own computer so that I own it. Um, so I've got a Windows computer and I use Roots Magic, although it's available for Mac as well. Family Tree Maker, also available for Windows and Mac, is also a really popular one. Um, can they spread out and out and out? Well, yes, although and I do try for every one of my ancestors. I do try and collect whole families, research whole families, and if I meet second or third cousins, I usually try and put in the links down to those people. But I have a limited time, so I don't try and research all the descendants of my fifth great grandparents or anything like that. Okay, so Ancestry, I have an account with Ancestry. Shall I recreate my family tree on Family Search too? Ancestry and Family Search have a different philosophy. Um, First off, be aware that the purpose of these of putting your family tree on Ancestry and on Family Search is to share it with other people. Um, I've met people who put their tree on Ancestry and then they're mad that other people copied their research, but really that's the whole idea is you want to share your research if you're putting it there. But they have a different philosophy. Ancestry.com has each person has their own family tree. Family Search has a single family tree for everybody. And yes, I would recommend you put your ancestors on Family Search, but first find the ancestors that are already there, and then add in any that aren't there. And feel free to add any information that you have that is not on Family Search. But that's one of the nice things about Family Search is it's really easy to see who made what changes to the tree, and you can contact them and ask them questions. And I've met up with some distant cousins there and exchanged some great information. Well, so my father's family, on his maternal side, were very poor and peasants. The town they were in is Kilteven by the bridge, and I've had a lot of difficulty following through on them. Any suggestions? Well, the best I can suggest is try and work through those the civil registration records and the church records, um, uh, and depending on the era, the Griffith's valuation will, because they probably will have rented property if they didn't own property. Um, those would be the records where you most likely find them.
George, this is from me. When you start researching an Irish ancestor, what's your process as far as trying to find them in the Catholic parish records? Do you go right to the official Irish site, or do you go to Ancestry or Find My Past first to find them indexed and then go to the Ireland site? And are they different indexers for Ancestry and Find My Past? And have you had better success with either one? What would be just your process?
Um, okay, there's a lot of questions there. Yes, Ancestry and Find My Past had different indexers, and sometimes you'll find something on one than the other. I couldn't say that any one is any better than the other, but my general process is try and find out where they came from, and from there, when I'm looking through the Catholic records, probably Find My Past would be my preference. Find them in the index, and then from there, I have exactly what I need to go to the Catholic Parish Records website and find the person.
And just for everyone's information, the library does subscribe to Find My Past, but you have to be on site at Central Library to use it. So right now it's off limits because the library is closed to the public at this time. But when we're open, you can come down and use Find My Past, but you have to be at Central Library for that. And as a reminder, Ancestry.com is available from home with one of our library cards. If you don't have one of our library cards yet and you live in Los Angeles County, just go to lapl.org and you'll see a tab for e-card registration. And once you have an e-card, you can go to our research area, find Ancestry Library Edition, and then you can have access to some of these resources George was talking about. Okay, are there any other questions? I think we're kind of slowing down a little bit on the questions, George, so thank you so much for spending time with us today and letting us know that that it's possible that we can absolutely find our Irish ancestors. And thanks for providing your email address. If anybody missed anything and you want to send me an email, go right ahead and I'll answer. But George, thanks so much for your time today.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye everybody. We'll see you next month for Armenian genealogy.